The real-life stories of the Gilded Age. Andrew Carnegie's phony daughter who stole millions. Cassie Chadwick.
This is a story about a woman who pretended to be the illegitimate daughter of one of the richest men on the planet. And because people bought into her lies, she was able to dupe a number of men into giving her millions of dollars. But before it was all over, her illegal shenanigans would bring her in contact with the richest man in the world and a United States president. I'll explain. She's the inspiration for the Maude Beaton character on The Gilded Age. The men who gave her money in real life called her Cassie L. Chadwick. Once they realized she stole their money, they probably called her a whole lot of other things that I can't say here. She was a flaming hot mess. Let's get into it. For those who are watching The Gilded Age, you have seen the very gay Oscar Van Ryn try his best to fall for a woman so that he can carry on the family name. And once he realized that he was not going to be able to take advantage of Gladys Russell for her fortune, he turned his gaze to Maude Beaton, the self-proclaimed illegitimate daughter of one of the richest men in the world, Jay Gould. And it looked like he had a real thing going. He genuinely liked her, even though his preference in the bedroom was man meat. And just when he made up his mind that he wanted to build a future with Maude and propose to her, we learned that she took him for almost every penny his family had. Well, Maude Beaton was based on a real-life woman who did the very same thing to a string of men from the 1880s until the early 1900s. Many of those men knew her as Cassie L. Chadwick, the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, who, in his prime, was the richest man in the world. What could go wrong? Before this lying harlot started calling herself Cassie Chadwick, she was born Elizabeth Bigley in Eastwood, Ontario, Canada, on October 10th, 1857. As a young girl, she was said to have had a mania for fine clothing. She started her life of crime in early adulthood. She was arrested for forgery in Woodstock, Ontario, when she was only 22. And she never did any time for that crime. She made a plea of not guilty by insanity, and it worked. Then, 3 years later, in 1882, the crazy lady got married in Cleveland, Ohio, and she married well. Probably because she lied to her husband about who she was. When she met him, she was posing as an heiress, and it worked. She married a doctor, Dr. Wallace S. Springsteen. And look, I found this ad of his. He had a cure for lady problems. Anyway, her marriage didn't last very long at all. 11 days to be exact. When her husband discovered her criminal background, he threw her little booty out of his house. After her days of being taken care of by the doctor were over, she ran a quickie swindle in Erie, Pennsylvania, under the name Madame La Rose. There, she told her friends that she had a lot of money, but she just couldn't get her hands on it at the time. She asked them to loan her money for an operation for a hemorrhage. Her condition was fake, but they believed her because somehow she managed to extract blood from her gums, and that made her look like whatever the hell she said she was going through. So her friends lent her the money and never saw her again. A couple of years later, under the name Lily Bagley, she moved into a boarding house owned by a Mrs. Hoover. By this time, Cassie was pregnant with someone's child. She wrote back home to Canada telling her mother and sister that she had married a wealthy old man named C.L. Hoover, and he was the father. He was also conveniently dead. At some point, her son, whom she named Emil Hoover, giving him his fake daddy's last name, went to live with her mother and sister, leaving her free to continue faking her existence as an heiress, getting a little more money with each new ruse. Cassie assumed another name, then began telling the world that she was a fortune teller, first as Lydia Scott, then as Madame Lydia de Vere. In that career, if you will, she committed forgery against one of her clients, earning herself a new home, the state penitentiary in Ohio, for a 9.5-year sentence. She was paroled by the governor after serving only 4 years. The governor at that time was William McKinley. Just 5 years after paroling her, he would become the 25th President of the United States. And just 4 years after that, he'd be dead, assassinated while serving as president. And what does a girl do after she gets out of prison? Well, this one married another doctor. She lived for a while under another alias while she was working at a massage parlor. One day, in walks Leroy Chadwick. He got a massage from her, then he wanted her hand in marriage. I don't know if she gave him a happy ending or what, but very shortly after that massage, she was married to Dr. Leroy Chadwick in 1897. His family was well known and well respected, and just the way that Mrs. Astor and New York City had their Astor's 400, the list of the top 400 people in high society who really mattered, other cities all around the country had their own respective 400 lists, and Dr. Chadwick was a member of Cleveland's 400. And he had no clue at all about Cassie's family, friends, or background, which meant that he didn't know about her criminal past. His relatives and friends were not fond of Cassie. To them, she was just some stranger who had appeared out of thin air. They were all in a very tight social circle, and not a lot of outsiders made it in. They thought it was extra strange that not even one of their own knew of Cassie, and they were protective of Dr. Chadwick because he had such a reserved and easygoing personality that they were concerned that someone might try to take advantage of him. And frankly, that was the vibe that they got from Cassie. Well, literally the year that she married Dr. Chadwick, she started going on a fraudulent borrowing spree. She borrowed, and I use that term very loosely, hundreds of thousands of dollars from multiple banks in Cleveland. And just how did this ex-con get her grubby little hands on those bank loans? I mean, her husband's medical practice was doing well, very well in fact, but using his Chadwick name wouldn't have qualified her for those kinds of big money loans. So she just used another name, Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie to be exact. And he just so happened to be the wealthiest man in the world at the time that Cassie was throwing his name around from bank to bank. But still, she was a Chadwick. So how did she get to the path of using the Carnegie name? She told everybody that she was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, and people believed her. The right people believed her. People with money. Bankers. This lying-ass bandit used $5 million in securities, certificates, and promissory notes forged with Andrew Carnegie's name as security. She even had proof of a trust that he had established for her worth just over $10 million. And who would question that? Surely he had the money, so in their eyes, she was good for it. They just gave her the money that she wanted. Think about it. This was the 1890s and very early 1900s when Cassie was running these schemes. Identification systems were either not sophisticated or non-existent. She wouldn't have had a driver's license in her purse to pull out at the bank. And being an illegitimate child wasn't a detail that someone would have been proud to share about themselves in the 1890s. So if she was saying it, it must have been true. And who was going to call out Andrew Carnegie for having a little fun on the side? Nobody was. Clearly, at the very least, he was financially providing for his daughter. So Cassie just showed up, wearing the right clothes, displaying the right mannerisms, pretending to be a rich lady of society whose father wanted to take care of her and was very generous with his money to her, because it was the least that he owed her, since she wasn't allowed to carry his last name or be reared in the same household with his legitimate children. That was how it was laid out. Everyone just took her word at face value and whispered in polite tones about Andrew Carnegie's rich bastard daughter while she blended in with the wealthy of Ohio, Massachusetts, and New York. Well, her time of playing the role of elite socialite was up when, in 1904, a man named H.B. Newton exposed her, and ultimately caused her to have to pay for her crimes. When he came forward with his claim against Cassie that she had stolen $190,800 from him, others who had been looking for her were able to file lawsuits against her as well for money that she had taken from them in just the same way, with her quote-unquote daddy's signature as security for the repayment. Cassie's November trial included a lineup of her victims. Here are the names and amounts of the money that some of them wanted to recover. Euclid Avenue Savings and Trust, $38,231.32. American Exchange National Bank, $28,808.25. And Savings Deposit Bank Elyria for $10,000. Including H.B. Newton's claim, she owed over $257,000 that she had stolen, but that was only from the bank presidents who weren't so embarrassed that they went public with how they had been taken. One of those embarrassed men was Charles Beckwith. He was the president of the Citizens National Bank in Oberlin, Ohio, a very tiny bank, and by the time that Cassie encountered him, her audacity and confidence were through the roof, so the $10,000 and $40,000 loans that she had obtained before were chump change. She requested from Mr. Beckwith $340,000 that included $100,000 for a personal loan. By all accounts, he was smitten with her and gave her everything that she asked for. And having those forged promissory notes from Andrew Carnegie didn't exactly hurt her chances of getting approved for a bank loan. But Charles seemed to have a very personal interest in Cassie. Altogether, Cassie had stolen roughly $2 million, jumping from various cities in Ohio to Massachusetts to New York, claiming that she was Andrew Carnegie's secret love child. Those are crazy amounts of money for the 1900s. Adjusted for inflation, that $2 million around the year 1900 would have been like Cassie stealing over $70 million today in 2023. And again, that only includes the amounts that people eventually came forth to claim. Long story short, Cassie was arrested on December 2nd, 1904. And from the looks of it, the cops got to her just in the nick of time. They found her at a room in the Hotel Breslin in Manhattan, apparently ready to make a run out of the state, possibly out of the country. Police discovered $100,000 in cash strapped around her waist. Then there was the trial. All of the details were laid out about so many of her crimes and so much money that she had stolen. But would any of those plaintiffs ever see their money returned? No, because Cassie was spending that money as quickly as she was stealing it. Her purchases were described as many and excessively extravagant, and that's saying a lot considering that she was doing this in the Gilded Age, a time when millionaires were literally painting rooms of their mansions in 24-karat gold. A great deal about Cassie's methods of carrying out her crimes came out in the trial. For instance, after she had gotten off on her first forgery charge, and before she married the doctor in 1882, earlier that same year, she got arrested for borrowing money and not repaying it. She was using yet another name, Alice M. Bastedo, and her collateral for that loan was furniture that belonged to her sister. And after that first doctor kicked her out after just 11 days of marriage, she tried to get $6,000 out of him as some type of lump sum alimony payment. He didn't have to pay her, but for perspective, that's equivalent to about $200,000 today. That's what she wanted in repayment for her 11 days of being a wife to him. In 1883, she faked her own death, writing to some friends that one of her many aliases had just been buried. And in 1887, she committed forgery to obtain an $18,000 loan. That was the crime that earned her the 9.5-year sentence, the one for which McKinley paroled her. Now, this is an interesting addition to that charge. A man named Joe Lamb helped her to commit that crime, and he was charged and tried right along with her. But he was acquitted on the ground that Cassie's hypnotic charm rendered him completely irresponsible. Good Lord, what did this lady have? What kind of charm gave her this kind of hold over people? I want some. I'm trying to do some research to see if she left behind a course or a how-to guide or even a journal for the rest of us ladies. If she did, I'll come back with a part 2 on Miss Cassie, 'cause damn. You see her photos, and none of the men who stole from her even claimed that they found her to be particularly good-looking, but there was this constant theme of men saying that she was hypnotic or they felt like they were under her spell. At any rate, by the time that H.V. Newton's charges brought her to justice, she was still married to the second doctor, Dr. Chadwick. But he had left Cassie in his mansion and went off to live in Europe with his daughter from his first marriage. But when the charges were filed against Cassie, they were filed against Dr. Chadwick too. The thought was that he was her husband, so he had to have known. He had to have been in on it too. She was wrecking men's lives from sea to shining sea. And poor Charles Beckwith, the president of Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, who had loaned her the $340,000 because of her forged Carnegie promissory notes, he had to close his little bank for good. She bankrupted his bank. One source said of Cassie's stealing and spending that, quote, she obtained vast sums of money from unknown sources and squandered vast sums in unparalleled extravagance, end quote. Now, I don't have a detailed list of how and where she spent all of this money, but I did learn that one of her extravagant undertakings with the stolen money was refurnishing her husband's mansion. She spent $200,000 on new decor. That's like you and I spending $7 million today with someone else's money. The nerve. Well, I hope that it was worth it for her, because on March 10th, 1905, Cassie Chadwick was convicted on 7 counts of conspiracy against the government and conspiracy to wreck the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin. Her husband, Dr. Chadwick, had to sail back to the United States from Europe and have his day in court too. But he was exonerated, and rightfully so. He literally had no clue of what his wife had been doing in his mansion while he was in Europe. And as was usual with Cassie, there was some drama in the courtroom after her guilty verdict was announced. Now, by this time in her life, Cassie was losing her hearing. She was partially deaf. So when the clerk stood to read the jury's verdict, guilty on all 7 counts, Cassie Chadwick just stood there in silence, flanked by her lawyer and her son, who was now grown. She hadn't heard a thing. Finally, her attorney, Francis J. Wing, told her, "We have lost Mrs. Chadwick." She turned beet red, then raised her hand to her head and sank down into her chair. When she was led away to her jail cell, she cried out, "Let me go! Oh my God! Let me go! I'm not guilty! I'm not guilty, I tell you! Let me go!" Then she fainted, but they still took her ass to jail. Then there was Cassie's sentencing hearing. And guess who attended? None other than Cassie's fake daddy, Andrew Carnegie himself. She was sentenced to 14 years in prison and fined a mere $70,000. That was nothing compared to all that she had taken from people. And I have to say that it's the money that she took from people, because that was the truth. Yes, the banks were holding it, and sometimes we can get a good laugh when we think about somebody sticking it to the system, sticking it to the banks. The banks are stealing from us. Now they know how we feel. But the fact was that Cassie stole from every account holder at those banks. This was before the days of Americans' money being secured by the FDIC. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation wasn't established until 1933. Quick note, if you're not an American and you aren't familiar with the FDIC, because I know that we have a lot of people in Ireland and England specifically who watch this channel, the FDIC is a government corporation that insures our bank accounts for up to $250,000 per account. Well, for the sake of Oberlin College, it's a good thing that Andrew Carnegie attended Cassie's sentencing, because when all of the facts came out about Charles Beckwith, the tiny bank president, the court learned that some of the money that he gave to Cassie belonged to Oberlin College. That meant that the money for the school was just gone. $50,000. But Carnegie stepped in to save the day for the college. He gave them triple for their trouble, replacing their lost $50,000 with a $150,000 donation for the construction of a new library. That building still stands today on Oberlin's campus, but now as home to the geology department and other administrative offices. Andrew Carnegie felt horrible for Cassie's victims, and he did help some other ones out as well. She was finally jailed on January 12, 1906, and once the trial was over, it was over for everybody else. Everybody except for the tiny banker, Charles Beckwith, who visited Cassie in prison to tell her, quote, "I am not convinced that you are a fraud, and I look for the time when everything will be straightened out." End quote. He could just not bring himself to believe it, even though he was financially ruined and his bank was gone. Even though he actually had to serve time in jail himself for having been so reckless with the money that belonged to his account holders. And a statement from one person could have saved him from going to jail, and that person was Cassie. Here's what he said about her on his deathbed. Quote, "I could have died happy if she had said one word to clear my name. When I first found that she could not meet her obligations, and I begged her on my knees to save the bank, she laughed in my face. The woman has wrecked my life and the life of thousands whose savings were entrusted to my care." End quote. But he was put out of his misery just a few weeks after visiting Cassie when he died in shame. He was almost as pitiful as a man could be by the end. He was blind, paralyzed, and delirious as he used his last breath to talk about Cassie. His doctor said that the only sense he had left was his sense of hearing, which I think is a little ironic considering that that was the only sense that Cassie didn't have. By the end, she was completely deaf. When the news of his passing reached her, members of the press showed up to her cell, wanting a statement. She was cold and had nothing to say to any of them. She said that she didn't care. But when left alone, in the confidence of a cellmate, Cassie told her that she thought that Beckwith would overcome his illness and get well. She said that the news of his death left her pained beyond expression. But one person did fare well as a result of Cassie's trial. This was a time when drugstore soda fountains were popular in the United States due to the belief that carbonated water was good for health. So there was a belief that sodas helped to cure ailments. Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper were created by doctors, and Pepsi was created by a pharmacist. Well, a Cleveland pharmacist came up with his own drink called Cassie Chadwick Nerve Tonic. Nerve, the one thing that she had plenty of. And if anybody in Cleveland needed some nerve, a sip of his refreshing tonic would hit the spot. It was a bit of a joke, but it did sell very well for him. As for Cassie Chadwick, she didn't get a lot of visitors in prison. Dr. Chadwick didn't visit her at all and barely spoke of her. Months after she was incarcerated, he he took his daughter with him to Florida, where he had a brother who owned a furniture store. Then Dr. Chadwick started selling furniture for his brother. And yet again, Cassie did not serve her full sentence. But this time, it wasn't because she got paroled. Remember that she was born on October 10th? Well, she died on her birthday, October 10th, 1907, at the age of 50, serving less than 2 years of her 14-year sentence. Her cause of death, according to the prison doctor, was a bad heart. Well, no one who had a seat at her trial would have argued with that diagnosis.
The mistress of a millionaire who became a millionaire, Arabella Huntington.
Hi everybody. I know that a lot of you are probably seeing my face for the very first time. Maybe you have heard my voice often. If you are new to the channel, then you're seeing my face and my voice for the first time. So thank you for coming. If you have been listening to me, thank you so much for helping me get to 135,000 subscribers without ever having even seen my face. I do want you to know that I'm a real person and I dress like this every day because I love history. But this isn't about me. Today we're here to talk about Arabella Huntington, the real-life inspiration for the character Mrs. Sylvia Chamberlain on HBO's The Gilded Age. HBO's The Gilded Age is another television show that is brilliantly written by Julian Fellowes, the creator of Downton Abbey. It's returning for its second season on October 29th, and there is no better place to talk about that show than this channel, Ty's Hot Mess History. I can't think of a better place. Whether or not you watch the show, if you like historical scandals, stay tuned for this episode. I'm covering all of the real-life people, places, and events that were depicted in the Gilded Age. But we have to keep in mind that it's a fictional show that's based in reality. The Gilded Age was a real time in history. The Russells and the Van Bryns and the Scotts are fictional families, but they interact with some of the wealthiest and most noteworthy people who did live during the Gilded Age. People like the Vanderbilts, Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan, and T. Thomas Fortune. They also interact with characters who were based on people who existed at that time. One of those characters is Mrs. Chamberlain. On the show, she is portrayed as a woman whose reputation is so bad that proper ladies should not even be seen in the same room as she. They should not speak to her. They should not even look in her direction. For if they do, their own reputations will be in jeopardy. Now that sounds extreme, but that was life in the 1880s. And why was she such a scandal? Because before her husband married her, while he was still married to his first wife, she was his mistress. And to make matters worse, she had a son with her husband. And doing the math, that son was conceived before they were married and while he was still married to his first wife, while his first wife was sick and dying. That's the story of Mrs. Chamberlain. She's based on the real-life Arabella Huntington. All of those things were true about her in real life. On the television show, she is also portrayed to be a very rich woman. This was also true about her in real life. Now, I don't know how many seasons there are going to be of the Gilded Age, but I do hope that they go into her story deeply enough and long enough to get to her second husband. They may or may not, but we will get to it today in this episode of Ty's Hot Mess History. Let's get into it. Arabella Huntington is the real-life inspiration for the Gilded Age character Mrs. Chamberlain, who is played by Jean Triplehorn. From this point on in her story, I will stop referencing the HBO TV show. If you watch the show, then you know which character I'm talking about. If you don't watch the show, that's just fine. The real-life story of Arabella Huntington is better than fiction, and you don't need to follow that TV show to follow this video. Arabella Huntington was one of the richest women in the country in her adult life, but she grew up poor and without a father. She made a name and a fortune for herself at a time when only men were able to make such moves. She married a man who knew how to make money, and she knew how to spend it. And I don't mean that she knew how to spend money in the typical sense, like when you think of a housewife who's married to a really wealthy man and she just spends his cash as quickly as he can earn it. No. What I mean is that she had a really good sense for business. She purchased items that appreciated in value, like real estate and art. She had one of the finest art collections in the country. She had every reason to be proud of herself. But she lived a great deal of her life in shame, and that had a lot to do with her son. She loved him, but times were different then. It was the late 1800s, and he was born out of wedlock. Her bundle of joy, her bouncing baby boy, was born a secret that she needed to keep. And from the moment that he was conceived, Era spent the rest of her life lying about the timeline of his existence in an effort to legitimize his birth to her high society circles that never really accepted her as one of them. But we'll get back to her son's birth. Here's what we know about her birth. Arabella was born around the year 1850. Remember, this is a time when birth records weren't exactly a top priority, and it was even less of a priority if you were a girl. Her parents were Richard and Catherine Yarrington. Arabella was born in Alabama, and that's where she lived with her family until her father died when she was about 9 years old. This left her mother, Catherine, in a tough position. You see, Arabella was just one of 5 children, so Catherine had to make some money to feed all of her babies, and she came up with a plan that worked. She opened a boarding house in Richmond, Virginia. Fast forward about 10 years. The man who would be Arabella's first husband crosses paths with her at her mother's boarding house. His name was Collis Huntington. He was part of what was called California's Big Four. That referred to the Big Four railroad company barons. Not only was Collis Huntington a part of the Big Four, he was the dominant member and the founder of Southern Pacific Railroad. Well, in 1869, he went to Washington, D.C. to lobby for federal money for a rail line going south from San Francisco. Now, this is the age of the robber baron. Here's how Oxford Languages defines robber baron: a person who has become rich through ruthless and unscrupulous business practices. Originally with references to prominent U.S. businessmen in the late 19th century. And Collis Huntington certainly fit this bill. And this is likely why he was the dominant member of the Big Four. On his lobbying trip in D.C., he fooled the members of Congress to get the money that he wanted. So he was asking for money to lay miles and miles of railroad track. And of course, it costs less to lay track over flat land than it does land that's going through mountain ranges. But Collis wanted to squeeze as much money as he could out of the government, so he presented fake maps of California, showing them mountain ranges that did not exist. Why? Because it cost twice as much to lay tracks in the mountains. Now we're talking the late 1800s here, a time when it wasn't really a common thing to take business trips to go and survey land, especially almost clear across the country. Anyway, his request got approved. He got all of the money that he wanted, which was a lot more than he needed for his project. And where did that extra money go? Right into his fat pockets. And after all of that lying to get his hands on some dough, a fellow's got to rest. And Collis Huntington rested at Catherine Yarrington's boarding house, Arabella's mom's place. And that is where he met his future wife, Arabella Yarrington, who would become Arabella Huntington if Collis got his way. And he usually did get his way. This was another one of those times that he got his way, eventually. But there were 2 obstacles in the way: John Worsham and Elizabeth Stoddard. John Worsham was the man who Arabella was dating. He ran a gambling parlor that Collis likely visited on his stay in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, some rumors went as far as saying that Arabella was married to John Worsham. That may or may not be true. But one thing that is true is that at that time that she was his girl, he was also a married man. Which brings us to the other obstacle to the Collis Huntington Arabella union, Elizabeth Stoddard. She was Collis Huntington's wife. But let's be real, Arabella obviously was no stranger to being with married men, and good old Collis didn't seem to be too concerned about his own wife. Roughly 9 months after Arabella met Collis, she had a son. There was always gossip about who the father was. Was it Worsham? The rumor was that after she got pregnant with Worsham's child, he left her, then went back to his wife. Or was Collis actually the father? It's hard to know, because she gave her son Worsham's last name. But is that something that she did just to keep scandal away from Collis Huntington's name? I truly don't know, because this woman lived her life telling one lie to cover up the next one for years. But what is known for certain is that after she became pregnant, regardless of who the child's father was, Collis Huntington took her to Texas, where she stayed for most of her pregnancy. She gave birth to her son in Texas. His name was Archer Milton Worsham, and after he was born, Collis paid for mother and son to move to New York City to live in a beautiful home that just happened to be very close to his own Park Avenue home, the home that he shared with the obstacle, Elizabeth Stoddard. She was Collis Huntington's wife, who was dying of cancer, while he was trying to figure out how to be closer to his new 19-year-old lover. And I guess that I can just throw this in before we get in much more deeply. So we have the theories about which man actually fathered her son. Well, her son, when he became an adult, threw his own theory into the pile. He preferred the thought that the wealthy railroad tycoon was his father, even though he had the last name of the other man. He contended that Collis took Arabella to New York to care for his invalid wife, and then, after that, the two fell in love and later conceived a child who was himself. It still doesn't make his parents seem like great people, but at least that way, it's the rich man's blood that is flowing through his veins in his version of the story. When Arabella arrived in New York City, she added another lie to her resume. She fashioned herself as the young widow of Worsham. And it's not like she was well enough known for anyone to be able to fact check her story, so it worked for a while. And I won't say that she taught Collis Huntington how to lie. He clearly knew how to tell lies, really good ones, as we can recall from his stunt to get more money out of the United States Congress. But he did join in on Arabella's lies about who she was and how she knew him. 7 years after he moved Arabella to Manhattan to live under his wife's nose, he took Arabella to Texas on a couples trip. But he told everybody that she was his niece, and their age difference certainly made that seem like a believable lie. After all, he was 30 years older than Arabella. But depending on what you value in life, you may say that her lies were worth it. I mean, she was a girl who grew up really poor, but as an adult, she was someone who would never know poverty again, because all of the lies that she told put herself in a position to get a very wealthy man to spend a lot of money on her. And he spent a lot of money on her, and he gave her a lot of money to spend, and she seemed to spend it really wisely. It's funny. He used to actually brag about how he never spent more than $200 on anything that he would wear. But when it came to Arabella, the sky was the limit. He showered her with everything that he could, and he loved to give her expensive jewels. But remember, she didn't just take money and just take things from him. She learned how to make money, and she was good at it. She took it upon herself to learn about real estate. She learned how to buy and sell high-end properties. As a matter of fact, J.D. Rockefeller bought one of the homes that she renovated to sell. She also learned about buying and selling stocks, and she made a fortune off of that too. Perhaps she thought that Collis would get tired of her one day and trade her in for an even younger mistress, so she'd better get all that she could while the getting was good. But he was in it for the long haul. That is, after his wife died. And his wife, Elizabeth Stoddard, died in 1884, allowing Arabella to step up from the role of the side chick to official wife. They say you can't turn a hoe into a housewife. Well, Collis Huntington begs to differ. As if this couple's story wasn't scandalous enough by itself with just the two of them, the reverend who officiated their wedding ceremony led a life that was so scandalous that perhaps he was the only one fit to bless this mess. He was Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. He was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of the American classic Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Reverend Beecher had only one wife, but he had a long string of mistresses, and they were bold. They would come to watch him preach in church every Sunday. A new mistress, sitting there next to the church's first lady, his wife. After the wedding, the couple moved into his Fifth Avenue home. They had the money and the mansion, but their scandalous reputations made it impossible to join the ranks of high society. The Astors were the gatekeepers, and they would not let them pass through. They couldn't get into the ballrooms of the Astors or the Vanderbilts, who were fairly new to high society themselves. Though they couldn't get into the ballrooms of the Astors or the Vanderbilts, that didn't stop the Huntingtons from enjoying their life and their money, and they had lots of it. Arabella got Collis into purchasing art, and she built one of the most impressive collections in the world. In the year 1900, Collis died while he was on vacation. He was 78 years old, and he left most of his fortune, 2/3 of it, to his wife, Arabella, about $150 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's like having $5 billion today in 2023. His death left her one of the richest women on the planet. Well, she only got 2/3 of his fortune. What about the other third? That went to Collis's favorite nephew, Henry Huntington. And guess what else he got that belonged to his deceased uncle? His wife. Yes, Arabella married Henry Huntington, her husband's nephew, which means that she married her own nephew. It was by marriage, but still, that was her nephew. If he was her husband's nephew, he was her nephew too. Handling all the arrangements for Collis's estate brought them closer together at a time when it just so happened that Henry found himself being more distant from his own wife. You heard that correctly. Arabella had once again moved in on another lady's husband. But hey, the blame isn't all on her. It takes two to tango, and he was the one who had made the commitment to his wife. Anyway, Arabella and Henry Huntington got married right after he divorced his wife. I guess just to give her a point, I should mention that even though she was his aunt, there was no big age gap. Remember, she was much younger than her first husband, and the nephew and she were roughly the same age, either born the same year or just 1 year apart. And he had a palace built for her in California that was bigger and more luxurious than anything that she had ever known in Manhattan. And Arabella Huntington lived a bi-coastal life until she passed away in 1924, making herself a scandal from sea to shining sea.
The architect of New York's elite who groomed a teen girl, Stanford White.
Whether or not you know the name Stanford White, you are likely familiar with, at the very least, the name of some or all of these projects. Tiffany House, Washington Square Arch, the White House, or at least part of its interior. Maybe you have even visited some of these landmarks. They all have one thing in common. Stanford White, the architect who designed them, and he was killed in one of those great structures that he designed, the second Madison Square Garden. He was killed over a woman. Her husband knew that Stanford White had been inappropriate with her, and that's putting it very mildly, when she was a young girl. The sad thing is that for this woman, Evelyn Nesbit, her husband was no better than Stanford White. This is the story of two disgusting predators, whose wealth made them look like gentlemen, and a young woman who was truly faced with choosing the lesser of two evils, and the murder case that was the first to be called the trial of the century. Let's get into it. Stanford White was an American architect who designed homes for the wealthy and public buildings. In case you have been watching HBO's hit show, The Gilded Age, he is depicted in the show as the man who designed the palace for the uber-rich George and Bertha Russell. Though they were a fictional couple, that's a pretty accurate description of who his typical clients were. He designed the spacious and luxurious palazzos for his clients, but he went above and beyond furnishing them with wares from fallen European homes. He understood his clients very well, the nouveau riche of Manhattan who had tons of money, but not the birth or class to truly establish themselves as members of high society. Stanford would help them to make that transition by organizing their parties and being on hand at those parties to be the mouthpiece for his clients. If you watch The Gilded Age, the way that he was depicted at Bertha Russell's poorly attended at home is how he was in real life for his multi-millionaire clients. He taught them how to function in the exclusive circles they so desperately wanted to be a part of. Some of his most well-known projects are the Washington Memorial Arch, the New York Herald Building, Pennsylvania Station, Madison Square Presbyterian Church, the Fifth Avenue mansions for the Astors and the Vanderbilts, and Madison Square Garden. The second one, the one that stands today, is the fourth one. The one that White built was located at Madison Avenue and 26th Street, the same location as the first one. It was constructed in 1890 and demolished in 1925. It is also where Stanford White was killed with 3 bullets to the back of his skull. When he built the second Madison Square Garden, he left his signature all over the complex, including a sunken pool for water shows, so that he could enjoy seeing women in skin tights, and a tower that had private apartments. The tower was topped with a Diana statue. She wore no clothes and was covered only in gilding. Many considered it to be a perverted display, but it showed where his mind was, for under that statue of Diana, in that tower were the private apartments. Stanley occupied one of them, and it was used for carrying on sexually with anyone who wasn't his wife, very often people who were underage. White came up in the days when a formal education was not necessary, and he did not have one. He developed his skills as an apprentice to Henry Hobson Richardson, who was one of the greatest architects of his day. Then, in 1878, he studied architecture for a year and a half in Europe, and it's easy to see the European influences in his work. When he returned to New York, he teamed up with 2 other architects and created the firm McKim, Mead & White, each of their last names. He designed a lot of buildings for a lot of wealthy people, and because of that, was able to change his own station in life. Stanford White was not born into wealth, but 5 years after he started his firm, he was able to marry into a socially prominent family because his hard work earned him a ticket into the right social circles. His wife was a 22-year-old Bessie Springs Smith. But for Stanford, like many men of his era, when he went out on the town, it wasn't with his wife, it was with one of his girlfriends. And it was while he was married that he lived his most scandalous double life that ended in his death. Stanford was killed by a woman's husband. When Stanford was sexually involved with her, she was not a woman, but a young girl, and it was against her will. The young woman was Evelyn Nesbit. It is impossible to tell the story of Stanford White's life, or at least his death, without mentioning Evelyn Nesbit. She deserves a separate video dedicated to her life. Evelyn was thought to be a neck-turning beauty in her day. She worked as a model who would pose for artists. One of those artists was famous, and he helped to make her famous. Charles Dana Gibson, the creator of the Gibson Girl. The Gibson Girl became an iconic symbol of beauty during the Gilded Age, and Evelyn Nesbit was the inspiration for one of Charles Gibson's most well-known Gibson Girl drawings. But before Evelyn was able to sit as a model for Charles Gibson, she was living a life that was not so glamorous in Pittsburgh. Evelyn's father, who had been an attorney, died when she was only 8, leaving Evelyn's mother to care for the child by herself. And if Evelyn's mother really did the best that she could for her daughter, Evelyn might have been better off on her own. Her mother was also named Evelyn Florence. I'll call her Florence for the rest of this episode so that there's no confusion. Florence was a homemaker and a dressmaker when her husband was living, but without his salary, she wasn't able to make ends meet. She made as many dresses as she could, even took in people to board in her house to make money. She found work at local shops and lied about Evelyn's age so that Evelyn could come to work with her and double their earnings. But even with all of that, she still ended up losing her house. And that's when she went full throttle with taking advantage of her daughter, who everyone remarked about how beautiful she was. Florence started taking Evelyn to modeling jobs. Eventually, Evelyn's modeling opened the door to a stage career, and after that, she made it to Broadway, where she met Stanford White. He loved showgirls, and he was particularly interested in Evelyn. He would throw parties at his private apartment. His wife was never on the guest list, but often the 16-year-old Evelyn Nesbit was on the guest list. Stanford White was 47 at the time that he first started entertaining her. He took a very personal interest in Evelyn. He paid for music lessons for her and used his connections to help advance her Broadway career. He even moved Evelyn and her mother from their tiny accommodations in a low-income rooming house in a poor part of town to an elegant hotel and started paying their bills. He told the world that she was his ward, as if he were some kind of guardian or father figure to her. In today's language, we would say that he was grooming her. And her money-hungry mother allowed it because she was tired of being poor and having to work so hard. Well, when Florence told Stanford that she wanted to go back to visit family in Pittsburgh, rather than saying that she would take her daughter with her, Stanford White offered to babysit Evelyn. Florence agreed to the arrangement. And it was while her mother was gone that Stanford dropped the father figure act and started acting really flirtatious and sexually suggestive towards Evelyn. Stanford had this red velvet swing in his apartment. He liked to put Evelyn on it, undressed, and push her until she almost touched the ceiling. He got something out of that. His behavior around Evelyn was already inappropriate, but one night while her mom was gone, things got even worse. He took, and I mean took in every sense of the word, her virginity after giving her alcohol, which was likely spiked with something. It caused her to pass out, and when she regained consciousness, she learned that she was no longer a virgin. It sounds so insane, but she ended up falling in love with him at this time. But when she learned that she wasn't the only teenager he would entertain in his apartment, she got jealous and started dating younger society men in an effort to make him jealous. During this time, the showgirls, stage actresses, chorus line dancers, gaiety girls, whatever you might call them, the ones who were very young and pretty and performing on a stage somewhere, had men lined up to court them. Sometimes the men were single. Almost just as often, they were married. They would come to their performances, want to meet them backstage where they would give them flowers and gifts and promises of leaving their wives, anything to be with these young, pretty performers. And that was the married men. The single men, of course, were just looking to make these women their wives, still offering gifts and wanting to wine and dine them and show them off around town. Evelyn was a prize in that set, and many offers came her way. Of course, her mother would have had to approve of the guys who wanted to court her, and she always turned down the ones with little to no money. Eventually, she settled on one. After repeatedly receiving flowers from a man whom she had never met, but only knew as Mr. Monroe from the signature on the cards on the flower bouquets, he decided to make himself known to her. In his final bouquet, he had a $50 bill, a little less than $2,000 in today's money in 2023. He introduced himself as Harry Thaw from Pittsburgh. Thaw was a nepotism baby, heir to a $40 million fortune made by his father in the coal and railroad industries. Because of his money alone, he passed her mother's smell test with flying colors. Regardless of the fact that he had a reputation for whipping women with horsewhips. Perhaps overshadowing that was that he also had a reputation for lighting his cigars with $100 bills. He literally had money to burn. Something that became very clear about Harry Thaw early on was that he was obsessed with Stanford White. He would harass Evelyn, asking her why her mother allowed Stanford to be around her. But his mania regarding Stanford had actually started before he ever met Evelyn. He had a type when he dated, and his type seemed to be whoever Stanford White had just finished dating. White's sloppy seconds. And Stanford hated Harry Thaw. Harry was jealous of Stanford. Stanford was the guy everyone wanted to be around. Everybody wanted to get into his parties. Harry was never invited to them, and he had to buy his friends and his women. His obsession with Stanford White became so serious that he hired private investigators to follow him. From that, he would certainly have learned what a lot of people already knew about White, and that's that he played the role of family man during the week with his wife and kids, and played the role of bachelor whenever he felt like it in his many other apartments and townhomes. His public-facing persona was that of a charming gentleman who everyone wanted to know. His dark side would be revealed to the public after his death in newspapers all over the country. Like many high society men, Stanford belonged to a lot of clubs. He designed the facilities where they met. His favorite club that he built was the Players Club. After an evening with his important friends there, the public Stanford would go out to dinner and a show. The private Stanford would host parties featuring nude women, or he would have one-on-one dates with young and underage women and girls, and reportedly, sometimes young men and boys too. So Thaw reported these findings to the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. He told them that Stanford White used his apartments as hideaways to drug and rape over 350 virgins. At one point, Evelyn was hospitalized with a horrible condition. Thaw was there to hold her hand and sponsor a trip to Europe for her recovery. He sent Evelyn and her mother, then met them there. And it was on this trip in Paris that he got Evelyn to tell him everything about her relationship with Stanford White. What he wanted to know more than anything was about the sex between the two of them. She disclosed that she lost her virginity to White. Then Thaw became enraged. Then she let him know that White had given her something to drink, and that she was in fact unconscious when the sex act happened. It wasn't because she wanted it to happen. He was still so angry, but not for Evelyn or her honor, or that she had been violated. He was angry about the fact that Stanford White got to take her virginity and he didn't. So he stayed on his best behavior for a couple of more stops on this European trip. Then, after the couple got settled in a castle in Austria, he beat her mercilessly, to the point that she had welts all over her body. When Evelyn returned to New York, she went straight to Stanford White and told him how she had been abused. He had his attorney to record her account. She said that he grabbed her throat, tore off her clothes, then whipped her with a cowhide whip. Remember, that was his thing. Now, this sounds sickening, but despite the fact that Stanford White had abused her against her will, or without her consent, Evelyn still loved him. But she also wanted to be a legitimate part of society, and to do that, she'd need to be a wife, not a mistress, which was all that Stanford could offer her. So she overlooked all of the other bachelors who had courted her and married Harry Thaw. And even though she married Harry and had been violated by Stanford in the worst way, she still loved Stanford. She took several opportunities to make snide remarks to Harry, comparing Stanford to him. Stanford just finished building 2 more buildings. You haven't built anything. Stanford gave me 5-carat diamonds. You only gave me 3 carats. Near the end of his life, though he didn't know just how near the end of it was, Stanford tried to get his affairs in order. He was drowning in debt thanks to his lavish lifestyle, throwing over-the-top parties and buying expensive jewels for chorus girls. He decided to sell some of his expensive art and furnishings. He didn't get to follow through on that because a warehouse fire destroyed everything he had. To make matters worse, he learned that Harry Thaw had detectives trailing his every move. Which leads us to June 25th, 1906, the day that Stanford White was killed. Ironically, he had a meeting that morning to plan a memorial for James McNeill Whistler, a painter who had died in 1903 and was a friend of his. Evelyn and Harry Thaw came into New York. As a married couple, they had been living in his family's estate in Pittsburgh. They were coming to New York as a pit stop on a way to Europe. Oddly enough, Stanford had planned on visiting Pennsylvania later that day, but he stayed in town to dine with his son, Lawrence, who was visiting from Harvard. They went to Cafe Martin for dinner, where Evelyn and Harry Thaw, coincidentally, were having their dinner as well. Nothing happened there. After dinner, Stanford went up to the rooftop theater at Madison Square Garden to take in the opening night of a new show. Harry and Evelyn were already there, in the theater. And Harry saw his opportunity to get rid of his competition, and he took that opportunity. He weaved his way through the crowd, walked right up to Stanford White, and shot him in the head 3 times, and killed him. The following day in the news, Stanford White's death was the story. Harry Thaw would have his day in court in what the news media called the trial of the century. The story sold a lot of newspapers because for the working class, this was a glimpse into the lives of the wealthy, people they despised because they worked so hard to make them rich, those filthy bosses of theirs as they saw it. Just for context, this was a time when 1% of the country's population controlled 90% of its wealth, and a number of those wealthy people lived on Fifth Avenue in houses built by Stanford White. So yeah, the working-class New Yorkers were eating this story up. They couldn't afford tickets to attend the theater at Madison Square Garden, but they were getting all of the drama that they needed from their 5-cent newspapers. The story was huge and quickly became a topic of dark pop culture. Just days after Stanford White's murder, a silent film was made, dramatizing it. While waiting to learn his fate in a prison cell, Harry dined on food from Delmonico's, about as upscale in dining as you can get. After pleading innocent by reason of temporary insanity, 11 weeks of testimony, and a jury deliberating for 47 hours, its members were deadlocked, and there was a second trial. In this one, Thaw's attorneys removed temporary and claimed that he was just flat out insane. After 25 hours of deliberation, the jury found Harry Thaw not guilty on the grounds of insanity, and he was sentenced to a prison for the mentally insane. Then, 7 years into his sentence, he was declared sane. How convenient. One of Harry's first orders of business upon his release was to divorce Evelyn. But she might have been okay with that, because even after all that Stanford White had done to her, she said that he was the only man she ever loved.
The black newspaper editor who rose to fortune and fame and lost it all. T. Thomas Fortune.
I'm Caucasian, I'm black. I'm Caucasian, I'm black.
In the eyes of the law.
In the eyes of the law.
That's absurd, right? The idea of you being black and then...
Well, then you're saying the law is absurd. I'm not absurd. The law is the law. We live by the rule of law.
Why did you decide to take a DNA test?
I did it just for the understanding and for the knowledge to clarify what my oral history was. And it clarified what I had known through oral history about our lineage and our heritage. My father said we were a mix of many things, which we are.
So you took a DNA test, and what did the DNA test reveal to you?
Native American, Black, and Caucasian.
Was it majority Caucasian, majority Black, majority Native American?
Caucasian, majority Caucasian, then Native American, and then Black. The Black was 4%, around approximately 4%.
This man is 4% Black according to his DNA results. I want you to keep that in mind as you watch this video. Because today, we're talking about the real life of T. Thomas Fortune, whose percentage of Blackness was likely close to this man's, or maybe even a little bit less. Yet, he's recorded in history as one of the nation's first Black journalists and newspaper editors. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that he was pretending to be Black in order to gain notoriety like some people do today.
What's up, y'all? Today I got an announcement to make. A lot of y'all, I guess y'all be feeling some type of way because y'all don't really think I'm Black. But Ancestry.com did tell me I was Black, so I have the right to say that I'm Black because I'm like Ancestry. All I know is I took the test and they said I was Black.
He identified as Black because he had to, according to the law of his time. Mental inertia is dead. That is a quote from T. Thomas Fortune, the subject of today's video. I find that statement to be true. I'm sure that if you Google T. Thomas Fortune, you'll see a description that reads something like, he was a journalist, editor, publisher, and civil rights leader for Black Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s. To that end, here's another one of his quotes. The race cannot succeed nor build strong citizens until we have a race of women competent to do more than bear a brood of negative men. What's that? Blaming your lack of success as men on women? Sounds right in line with a lot of civil rights activists to me. No wonder he's considered a father of the movement. We'll get back to those civil rights leaders a little bit later. T. Thomas Fortune was much more than a list of quotes, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about him today. HBO's The Gilded Age is a television show that is brilliantly written by Julian Fellowes, the creator of Downton Abbey, and we're gearing up for its return on this channel, Ty's Hot Mess History. I can't think of a better place. It's my favorite channel. Whether or not you watch the show, if you like historical scandals, stay tuned for this episode. I'm covering some of the real-life people, places, and events that have been depicted on The Gilded Age, the TV show. But The Gilded Age was a real time in history. It lasted roughly from the 1870s until 1900, give or take a few years, depending on which historian you ask. It was a period of massive economic change. Vast fortunes were made by a few. Sometimes those fortunes were lost. For the wealthy, it was all about the rivalry between old money families and new money families. For the working class, their thoughts were to hell with all of them, old or new. They've earned their wealth on our backs. The main characters on this show, The Gilded Age, come from fictional families that are like the old money and new money families that would have existed at that time. But they interact with some of the wealthiest and most noteworthy people who did live during the Gilded Age, like the Vanderbilts, Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan, Stanford White, Ward McAllister, and the topic of today's video, T. Thomas Fortune. This is how he is described in the show's character guide. Quote, an influential member of the Black intellectual community in New York as an activist, journalist, writer, editor, and publisher of the New York Globe and other papers. End quote. He is played by actor Sullivan Jones, who admitted that he didn't know a lot about T. Thomas Fortune before he became a part of this cast, and that is not surprising. Even though T. Thomas Fortune played a big part in what would eventually become the civil rights movement in the United States. His name is often left out of the same conversations as people like Ida Wells, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, even though it was T. Thomas Fortune who gave Du Bois his first writing job. I mean, he started the National Afro-American League, which is a precursor to the NAACP, in 1887. Here's a photo of that organization in 1902, showing Ida Wells and Booker T. Washington on either side of that minister who's in the center. Now, if you've been around my channel for any length of time, then you probably already know that I don't pedestalize those civil rights leaders from the past. I think that some of them were well-intentioned at times, and at other times, not so much. I often question the motive behind their fighting and marching. But that's a topic for another day, or maybe later today after you watch this video. You can look at some of my other videos on those guys to understand my position. I have published videos that take critical looks at Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey, the NAACP itself, when a couple of its members dressed like this for some costume party fun. Ron Karenga, the man who is often credited as being the founder of Kwanzaa and who had his own Black freedom group in the 1960s. He was also convicted of beating and torturing 2 Black women who he held as prisoners for weeks. There are also 2 separate videos that I published about 2 different Black civil rights leaders, each who referred to a Black woman they had an issue with as Aunt Jemima. In case you don't know who Aunt Jemima is or why that matters, because I do know that we have people who are watching this channel and they're not necessarily in this country. Hi, Rida, Boy and Chew, Crazy Lion, and everybody else who's watching. Aunt Jemima was an American breakfast brand that sold things like pancake mix and other breakfast items that actually started in the Gilded Age in 1889. Aunt Jemima was never a real person. Instead, she was a mammy caricature of a Black woman who served up pancakes with a big old smile and a rag on her head, and she spoke in broken English. While times were moving forward, Black Americans were too, getting jobs and educations and really assimilating themselves into American culture. Aunt Jemima was happy to just keep doing what she had been doing on the plantation, serving up a big old heaping, helping old pancakes. And she did it with a smile on her face because she was too ignorant to know any better. This is what 2 Black civil rights leaders called 2 different Black women. This is part of the reason why I've learned to not take most Black civil rights leaders and organizations too seriously. I mean, people who say that they are fighting for the rights of Black people, calling Black women Aunt Jemima? Were they fighting for Black people or just Black men? Those 2 civil rights guys, by the way, were Curtis Graves and Cecil B. Moore, 2 Black men with fair complexions. And Curtis Graves got the nickname the Agitator at the height of his career. T. Thomas Fortune was also called the Agitator in his day. Well, this video is not about those civil rights guys, but T. Thomas Fortune, another Black man who fought for the civil rights of Black people and had, at times, his own strange remarks about Black women. He also happened to have a very fair complexion, so light that he was often taken for white. We'll look into a story that conveys how his outward appearance likely helped him to excel a little bit, and more on the life of T. Thomas Fortune, another Gilded Age character who was a real-life person. This is not a hit piece about T. Thomas Fortune, nor a love letter to him, but rather just a look into the life of a man who did a lot of good, but probably, like you and I, could have done a little bit better. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that like button to support this video. Thank you. In case you are one of the people who watches the TV show The Gilded Age, I want to let you know that T. Thomas Fortune looked nothing like the actor who plays him. If you don't watch the show and you're simply here because you like historical content, thank you. We're about to get into his real life right now. Fortune practically looked like a white man. And to be clear, I'm not bringing this up to say that this was a poor casting choice. I don't think that a good actor necessarily has to look like the person whom he or she portrays. I'm bringing this up because T. Thomas Fortune's complexion and features were so close to white that he existed in a way that was very different from what it would have been for a man who looks like Sullivan Jones, the actor who plays him. You'll see that in a news story that I share with you later in this video. The T in T. Thomas Fortune stands for Timothy. He was born into slavery as Timothy Thomas Fortune on October 3rd, 1856, in Marianna, Florida, on the Eli P. Moore plantation. His father was Emmanuel Fortune Sr. He was a shoemaker and tanner, meaning someone who converted animal skin into leather. After the Civil War, he was elected to the Florida legislature during the Reconstruction era. His strategy to keep himself safe was to have a moderate political stance. No ideations too far to the right or too far to the left so as to not upset either side. But that plan didn't keep him safe from the Ku Klux Klan. They gained a lot of strength in the 1870s, and Emmanuel Fortune became one of their targets, forcing Emmanuel to move his family from their home to Jacksonville, Florida. By the time that he died in 1897, this is what an obituary in the Herald and Review had to say about his career. Quote, he had been a member of the Florida legislature, marshal of the city of Jacksonville, and had filled minor local and county offices. End quote. Now, you might be thinking something like, wow, that's really impressive for a black man to have been able to accomplish those things in the 1800s. Well, here's what was written about Emmanuel Fortune's parents, who are T. Thomas Fortune's grandparents, in that same obituary. Quote, his mother was an octoroon, and his father was an Irishman. End quote. So his father was white, and his mother was practically white. In case you're not familiar with that term, an octoroon refers to someone who has 1/8 African ancestry, meaning 1 great-grandparent who is black and 7 who are white. Octoroon isn't a term that's used today because it is an offensive term, but also because today we would call a person with that small a percentage of blackness white. Like, who would look at them and know? An example of a notable octoroon is Louisa Piquet, who was born into slavery and obtained freedom only because her master died. Remarks about her looks compared her to a white woman, which only makes sense. She looked white because, for the most part, she was. Then there was T. Thomas Fortune's mother, Sarah Jane Myers Fortune. As is often the case when I'm researching, or at least attempting to research women from this era, there was not a lot of information to find out about Sarah Jane. I was able to find out that she had 5 children with Emmanuel Fortune, 3 daughters and 2 sons, and I learned that she died in 1871. I found a picture of what someone says is a picture of her online, but it's not from a site that I trust, so I did not include that picture in this video. I like to have at least 2 sources that have the same information in them before I feel comfortable sharing the information with you, so that at least I can verify, cross-verify, find some way to check it before I bring it to you. The Miami Herald said that Emmanuel and Sarah Fortune had 5 children, but T. Thomas Fortune is the only one about whom I saw a lot of information. Because T. Thomas Fortune's father was a senior, Ernest Fortune Sr., I presume that there must have been an Ernest Fortune Jr., and I did see a brief mention of him in one source that said that he was the co-owner of the New York Age, owning it with T. Thomas early in his career. I found a copy of an obituary, but I couldn't verify the original source. But back to T. Thomas Fortune. After the Civil War, Union soldiers provided a very basic education for the black children in T. Thomas's town. He learned as much as he could, and continued to build on his education throughout his life, whether it was through formal education or apprenticeships. While his father was working in the Florida legislature, T. Thomas was also working there as a page, delivering various forms of correspondence, filing papers, tasks of that nature. After his family fled to Jacksonville, you could say that Thomas got his start in his newspaper career. It was there, for a paper called the Daily Union, that he found work as a printer's apprentice. After working there for some time and learning a great deal, a black congressman found him another job in Delaware, working in a customs office. From there, he went on to attend Howard University while working part-time for another newspaper. Then he returned home and married Carrie Smiley, who was his childhood sweetheart. Since I've mentioned her, let me tell you the little bit about her that I was able to learn. You know, girls in history. She had 2 children with T. Thomas Fortune, and after he moved into his grand house called Maple Hall, shortly after she moved into that house with him, she separated from him, and she died in 1940 from a heart attack. I cannot express how frustrating it is to only be able to find out so little about these women. Pretty much the only thing that I'm able to find out is when they got married, if they had children, and when they died. That's pretty common, and it's unfortunate. She died in 1940, we know, but in this point of the story, as far as T. Thomas Fortune is concerned, she's still alive, and I will get back to that Maple Hall house, but let's continue. After Fortune married Carrie, he stayed in Jacksonville for a while and went back to work on the paper where he had been an apprentice, the Daily Union. Then he moved to New York to work for the New York Globe, a black newspaper. This was a time when the media was pretty segregated, so it's not uncommon to have newspapers that cater to black audiences and newspapers that cater to white audiences. So it's nothing for us to get upset about in 2020-30. That's just the way that it was. He was a writer and an editor at the New York Globe, and that's where his career really seemed to take off. And from this point, a lot of quick stories written about him would pretty much say, the rest is history, and then they tell you when he died. But I did a little digging, as I often do, as I always do, and I found one stop in his career that he made before he got to the Globe, one stop in New York. And it gives an interesting look into his life at that time. It was when he was working for a religious publication called The Weekly Witness. I found the news article from 1880, and I'm going to share it with you. I really enjoy sharing these news stories from the past because I think that they give us a more colorful look and realistic look at how people lived then and how they thought and even how they spoke, because this was a time before political correctness was a thing, so people wrote in a really frank way. And I think that sometimes these newspapers and even magazines give us a look that's less polished than what we get in history books, and therefore a more real look at things. This article was called Colored Men at the Case: Trouble in the Office of a So-Called Religious Contemporary. And the story reads, quote, I'm going to say bear with me because it's kind of a long story. I'm going to read most of it, not all of it, but just bear with me. Quote, 2 colored compositors were working quietly at their cases yesterday in the office of the Weekly Witness, and 6 white compositors who had quit work and refused to work with them were lounging about the room. The colored men had been working for the paper for several months in a room below, where no objection to their presence was made by 6 white men employed in mailing. It appears that the work on the Witness got behind last Tuesday night, and as there was insufficient light in the mailroom, the colored men took their cases upstairs and placed them on the vacant stands that had been used for the Daily Witness. The white men grumbled a little, but they did not stop work, and the paper went to press as usual. But on Wednesday morning, there was trouble, and 6 of the 8 white men refused to work any longer unless the colored men were removed. The foreman was out for breakfast, and when he came back, the white men stated their case to him. The substance of their story was they thought it was very bad that 6 white men should be made to give way, as they put it, to a couple of niggers. The foreman was first inclined to temporize, and put the colored men in their former place downstairs. But on reflection, he concluded that he would not accede to the demand. In explanation of the matter, he said yesterday, now this is the foreman talking, "You see, this circus all went on while I was away. When I got back, I was going to put the colored men back in their old places, but I couldn't make up my mind to do it. I had found them to be steady, sober men. They were civil and gentlemanly and good workmen, and they had helped us out when we wanted help on the Daily Witness. And I just says, and it does say says, and I just says, these colored men shall stay if it takes the roof off." Okay, that's ending his quote. And there they are. The first one that came to work was Walter Sampson. After a while, he offered to get us a colored friend of his to help from Jacksonville, Florida, named T. Thomas Fortune. We found Fortune a sober, industrious, capable man. As for discharging the men, we don't propose to do it. Both Mr. Dougal and Mr. Cochran, the proprietors, are in favor of keeping the colored men as a matter of principle and justice, and we shall keep them at all hazards. Pause. Before we go on, I want to let you know that this Walter Sampson guy isn't insignificant in the story of T. Thomas Fortune. Shortly after the story that we're reading right now concludes, months later, Walter Sampson went on to start his own paper called Groomers, and he hired T. Thomas Fortune to write for him. Groomers eventually changed its name to the New York Globe, one of the publications that is most commonly associated with T. Thomas Fortune, and that is definitely a part of his legacy. So back to the Weekly Witness now. I'm going to go back to the story, but I did skip a little bit. At this point, we're going to get into the physical descriptions of both Walter Sampson and T. Thomas Fortune. Remember, we're talking about two colored men whose being colored is causing such a ruckus that men can't get their work done. Listen closely to how they are described. Quote, Walter Sampson, the younger of the colored men, is about 23 years old, stoutly built, rather light complexion, straight and good-sized nose, of by no means African type, and curly hair. He is sprightly and gentlemanly in appearance, and might pass for a Spaniard. I cut off some more of the story in between this, but now we get to T. Thomas Fortune's description. Quote, T. Thomas Fortune, the other colored man, might easily pass for a bronzed southern white man. He is 28 years old. His nose is long and thin. His hair is straight. His lips are thin. His general appearance not unlike a tall Indian. He says there's some Indian blood in his veins, but that he was formerly a slave and calls himself a Negro. Pause. Calls himself a Negro. It sounds like the writer is saying, he calls himself a Negro, but I wouldn't call him one. Am I the only one hearing the story of two men who have such a minuscule amount of blackness in them that people look at them and don't even see black or colored at that time? Men? Anyway, the story goes on to read, quote, Inquiry among the dissatisfied white compositors developed a rather bitter feeling against the colored men, not on account of their personal conduct, but purely on account of their color. It's simply a question of personal equality, said one. I don't propose to work with a Negro, said another. The proprietors of the Witness say they will not back down. End quote. So the two colored men had a favorable outcome after all. And I think that that was the right decision. They were merely doing their work, doing their part to help the publication meet its deadline. But those physical descriptions are here for us to see. I must say that I cannot help but wonder if the outcome would have been different for colored men who actually looked like colored men. If T. Thomas Fortune had dark skin and a wide nose and thick lips and didn't look like a bronzed southern white man, would he have been able to accomplish all that he had? Would he have gotten the position as the page in the Florida legislature if it had not been for his father, who again was only 1/16 black? Would he have gotten hired as an apprentice at the Daily Union had he looked more like the actor who plays T. Thomas Fortune than how he actually did in real life? If he looked very different from how the foreman of the Weekly Witness described him, would he even have been able to get hired there? I don't know the answer for sure, but I can say that I doubt it. But let me know what you think in the comments. Thomas lived in a time when a rule of hypodescent was commonly applied to people who were racially mixed with black and white. Hypodescent is defined as the automatic assignment of children of a mixed union between different racial groups to the group with the lower status, regardless of proportion of ancestry. Regardless of proportion of ancestry. So in other words, a man like T. Thomas Fortune's father, who had one completely white parent and one who was only 1/8 black, even though he was by far mostly white, he would legally be recognized as black simply because black people held the lower socioeconomic position. So he looked in the mirror and saw what everyone else saw, a white man. Just like the guy at the beginning of this video who actually has a higher percentage of black or African ancestry, according to his DNA, than T. Thomas Fortune's father. But the law of the land would not allow the Fortunes to be recognized as white. This still happens today. Former President Barack Obama is a good example. He doesn't look white, but he has a white parent. He's called the first black president of the United States, when he is in fact the first biracial president. It is widely known that he has a white mother, yet he is called black. I believe that one of the reasons that T. Thomas Fortune identified as black or colored during his lifetime was because he felt that he had no choice. Now, maybe he would have chosen to identify as black if he'd had a choice. I don't know for sure. If you're hearing this and the one-drop rule is coming to mind, you have the right idea. It's the same principle, but the one-drop rule is the most extreme form of hypodescent. Typically in the years right before and right after the Civil War, the cutoff marks were somewhere between 1/4 and 1/16, meaning that if you had less African or black blood than 1/4 or 1/16, then you would be considered white. If you had more than that, then you were considered black. That percentage requirement varied from state to state. But according to the one-drop rule, on the other hand, forget about any of those fractions. Having even 1% or less, any black blood at all, made you black or African. It's actually crazy to think in those terms today, especially when you consider all the people who have had their DNA ancestry tested. And you've seen the videos on YouTube when people use services like MyHeritage or 23andMe, and you'll see some person who is like completely a white guy, and he'll say, oh, I've got, 5% black, and again, no one will look at that person and say, oh, that's a black guy. That's a soul brother number one. It's just insane to me to think about today. And remember, this man from the beginning of the video is 4% black. That's a higher percentage than T. Thomas Fortune's father for sure, maybe even higher than T. Thomas Fortune himself. And I have to mention as we go forward that to mention T. Thomas's racial makeup is not in any way to take away from any of the work that he's done or has been given credit for, or any of the accomplishments that he has achieved. In many things that he did, he was actually self-taught. He learned how to use the printing press. He was a gifted writer. He knew how to stir up people's emotions as an orator. He was a journalist. He was influential. He was the editor for the most highly circulated black newspaper in his time. He accomplished those things, whether he chose to be black or was told that he had to be black. Those things happened. Those things existed. I will not take any of that away in this video. That's not the intent. But getting back to the New York Age, the most successful black newspaper of its time because of its high circulation, again, he did that. But even though the paper was successful, it did struggle financially. And when it did, Booker T. Washington was there to put some cash in T. Thomas Fortune's hands. And in exchange for this kindness, sometimes T. Thomas Fortune would play the role of Booker T. Washington's pet. He would write and print whatever Booker T. Washington wanted him to. So, like many humans, there were times when sometimes he would bend his morals just to get some money. Fortune's life wasn't perfect, and too often his last name, Fortune, was ironic, because often for him, money was tight. There was pressure coming at him from a lot of angles, and to cope, he drank too much. His personal ideologies were radical, so he aligned himself with the radical thinkers of his day. But he was seen as two-faced because Booker T. Washington was conservative. And since often he was funding T. Thomas Fortune would do whatever Booker T. Washington wanted him to do. And sometimes that meant publicly criticizing those radical thinkers who he really did agree with in real life. And some of them he knew in person. Some of them, I'm sure, considered him a friend. But once Booker T. Washington and his cash stepped into T. Thomas Fortune's life, those friends didn't matter anymore. Fortune quickly earned a reputation for being a liar and a hypocrite and a traitor. But to add to his list of accomplishments, he and his wife reared 2 children who grew up to be successful. Their daughter, Jessie Fortune Bowser, was written about in Black society pages the same way that the daughters of the Astors and the Vanderbilts were. She became a teacher, which was a very respectable profession, especially during that time, and she married a teacher. Their son, Frederick Fortune, was also a member of Black society, like his sister. He was written about in the same society pages like she was. He studied and went on to become a doctor. Of course, before he became a doctor, he graduated high school, and he did that right in Red Bank, in the neighborhood where their big Maple Hall home was. And in that same year, 1910, T. Thomas Fortune lost his home. He had to leave Maple Hall. And a few years before that, his wife left him. Let's rewind. Buying that house in 1901 was the highlight of that decade for T. Thomas Fortune. It was a big deal for everybody. It was a big deal that this Black newspaper man was buying this big house in this exclusive neighborhood. It even made headlines. Then after that, it seemed like everything went downhill for T. Thomas Fortune. After getting settled into that big house, his wife left him. Then he suffered a mental and physical breakdown. He eventually recovered from those breakdowns, but after he did, he lost his home. All of this happened from the years 1901 to 1910. He fell into obscurity after the breakdown, and he even left journalism. He did eventually return to work, but he never gained the success that he had before or the notoriety. And finally, on June 2nd, 1928, after years of declining health, T. Thomas Fortune passed away at Mercy Hospital in Philadelphia at the age of 71. Thankfully for him, while he was at the hospital, he got a lot of special attention from one doctor in particular, Dr. Frederick W. Fortune, his son. In addition to leaving behind his children, Maple Hall, though he lost the home, is still a part of Fortune's legacy. An Italian family named the Vaccarellis bought it and ran a commercial bakery there from 1918 until 2007. Even though the home was in their possession for almost a century, Maple Hall was named a National Historic Landmark because T. Thomas Fortune lived there. The house was on its last leg in the 2010s and looking quite ready for nothing more than demolition when Roger Mumford, a white residential developer, was looking for a way to do his part to help ease racial tensions between Black and white people in America. His family immigrated from England to Virginia in the 1960s when he was only 7. and seeing the whites-only signs in public spaces never sat well with him, even as a child. And in the 2010s, it seemed as though race relations were only getting worse. Until that point, a group of protesters were able to raise awareness and raise their voices in protest against tearing down Maple Hall. But what they had not been able to raise was money. The money that was needed to repair the building and to keep it up and keep it going. Well, Roger Mumford bought the house from the Vaccarellis for $925,000 and completely renovated it, then turned it over to a nonprofit board under which the house now operates as the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. And it looks stunning. If you don't know, I had a long career in construction management before I came to YouTube. And reading about some of the methods that Mumford employed to restore this structure was just fascinating to me. He used modern engineering and equipment where he could and for the things that he needed to, like elevating the house in order to repair the foundation and removing asbestos siding from the house. But he hired old-fashioned craftsmen to recreate intricate detailing in the home for things like replacement moldings and decorative rosettes so that they matched the deteriorated originals. I suspect that anyone visiting that house now would have a really good idea of what T. Thomas Fortune and his wife and children saw when they walked into their home for the first time in 1901. Mumford also built 4 luxury rental units on that 1-acre property to make the deal a financially viable one for himself. And when the series premiere of The Gilded Age aired last year, the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center had its doors open for a screening of the show. I think that's a good full circle moment for a man who had such an impact, but whose name has been relatively obscure in circles where it should be spoken. Like I said earlier, there are remnants of T. Thomas Fortune and a lot of men who are seen as Black political and civil rights leaders. If you want to see my videos about any of the ones who I mentioned earlier in this video, the link to a playlist will be in the description box for you.
The Gilded Age Snob who ended up an outcast, Maude McAllister.
A dinner invitation, once accepted, is a sacred obligation. If you die before the dinner takes place, your executor must attend. That is a quote from Maude McAllister, the subject of today's story, and that tells you almost everything that you need to know about him. But of course, I'm going to tell you a lot more. The main characters on the show, The Gilded Age, come from fictional families that are like the old money and new money families that would have existed at that time, but they interact with some of the wealthiest and most noteworthy people who did live during the Gilded Age, like the Vanderbilts, Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan, T. Thomas Fortune, and the topic of today's video, Maude McAllister. This is how he is described in part in the show's character guide. Quote, Maude McAllister is chiefly remembered now as the inventor of the phrase, the 400. This was the number of people who were worth bothering with in New York society. McAllister serves as Mrs. Astor's right-hand man, and his chief business and pleasure in life is to help her guard the gates to high society. End quote. It goes on to talk about his dealings with some of the other fictional characters in the show, but I'll leave that out because it's not important for this video. And I know that some of you who will watch this video do not watch the show, and I appreciate you for being here. But as I've said in previous videos, you don't have to follow that TV show to follow this video. We're talking about the real life of Maude McAllister, the high society snob who valued nothing more in life than wealthy people and a great party. And in the end, those rich people who he admired more than anything on earth turned on him. I don't know if the TV show, The Gilded Age, will last long enough to get to that part of his life, but we're going to cover it here today on this episode of Ty's Hot Mess History. Let's get into it. Maude McAllister is the eccentric, highfalutin gatekeeper to New York City's high society on The Gilded Age. He is brilliantly played by Nathan Lane, who gives some good moments of comic relief on the show. From this point on in this episode, I think that I'll only mention the TV show one more time. If you watch the show, you know exactly who the character is. If you don't watch that show, I'm also glad that you're here today, and that's okay that you don't watch it, because we're going to get into his real life, which is better than fiction. At the height of his popularity in the late 1800s, Ward McAllister was the right-hand man to Caroline Astor, and he decided if multi-millionaires got to be a part of the in crowd, his 400. The funny thing is that based on his own background, he likely never would have let himself become one of the 400. Ward was born on December 28, 1827 in Savannah, Georgia, to parents Judge Matthew Hall McAllister and Grace Charlotte. Now, this is the one last time that I want to mention the television show The Gilded Age in this video, because I have wondered since last season, does Nathan Lane play Ward McAllister with that comically thick Southern accent because Ward McAllister is from Georgia? Or did the research staff find something that led them to know or believe that that is the way that Ward McAllister would have talked? It's like a really thick Southern accent, and when he laughs, it's like, So I've always wondered, like, is that real, or are they just kind of, I guess, taking some creative license there? Anyway, Ward's father was a Princeton graduate who was prominent in Southern politics. He'd been elected as mayor of Savannah for multiple terms. He met Ward's mother, Grace, in 1820. They got married and had 5 sons and 1 daughter. The first was Ward's oldest brother. In 1895, the son reported that he had served in the Mexican War and was buried at West Point. But his name was never mentioned. I did a little digging and finally found his name, Julian McAllister. One of the things that stood out the most about him beyond his lifelong military career was that in 1862, his wife, Elizabeth, died of burns when a dress that she was wearing caught on fire. Can you imagine? Their second son was Hall McAllister, and he was one of the most successful lawyers on the West Coast. Then came Ward McAllister, the topic of today's video, who was born Samuel Ward McAllister. He grew up to be a very good real estate lawyer before he became a full-time socialite. But it seems like law and politics just ran in his family's blood. And 2 years after Ward was born, his younger brother, Francis, was born. He studied theology and became a minister. He was the only sibling at Ward McAllister's side when he died, but we'll get there later. In 1832, his last brother, Benjamin Cutler, was born, and surprise, surprise, he went on to practice law as well. An interesting thing that I learned about him during my research was that there were 2 totally different sets of obituaries printed for him when he died in 1879. One set, mainly the ones printed in and around San Francisco, where he had made a living and established his family, said that he died from pneumonia. Almost everywhere else in the country printed that he died from an accidental gunshot wound. The story there was that he had gone to visit friends and family for the holidays in Florida, and a friend accidentally shot him. I guess Florida man stories have always been with us. If you know, you know. But the thought back then was that maybe the San Francisco area papers printed his cause of death as pneumonia because they didn't want to shock his family because his family was there. And in 1883, his parents had their last child, a girl named Harriet Hannah. I didn't find anything about her except that she died the same year as Benjamin. Before Ward and his brothers and his father, Ward's paternal grandfather had been a judge too, Judge Matthew McAllister. He was appointed by George Washington as the first United States District Attorney for the state of Georgia. In 1830, when Ward was in his early 20s, he left Georgia and moved in with a relative. Her name was Mary Telfair, and he lived in New York City with her. While he stayed with her, he studied law, then went west to live and practice law in California. A few years later, he went back to the East Coast and got married. His wife was Sarah Gibbons of New Jersey. She came from a wealthy Southern family, so he married into some money. Even though his family seemed like an important one, they were basically only big fish in a small pond when compared to the likes of the multi-millionaires who Ward would encounter later in Manhattan's very competitive social scene. And when considering that by those people's standards, the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, and the likes, he was poor, it kind of makes you wonder what it was about him that allowed him to judge anyone else's worthiness. He must have had charm and social grace for days. And I say this because he had to have something that captivated people. And the way that he was written about in multiple sources was not flattering, to say the least. His family wasn't that important, and the money that they had didn't compensate for their lack of social standing. He wasn't extremely good-looking or wildly ambitious. He was actually the opposite of the men who he was judging to see if they were good enough to become a part of high society. This is how he was described in one of the many articles about him after his death. Quote, "In appearance, Mr. McAllister was of medium size, thick-set, weighing about 175 pounds, of a ruddy complexion. He wore mustaches and an imperial, which in his latter years were gray. He walked with a peculiar swinging gait. Though not a wealthy man, he enjoyed a comfortable income of $20,000 a year." End quote. Now, that $20,000 per year in the late 1800s would have made him very comfortable. For perspective, adjusting for inflation, that $20,000 per year is like having roughly $600,000 per year in 2020-30. But when you stack his $20,000 against men who are making literal millions in that same time period, a lot of those men who were being judged by Ward McAllister would have been billionaires by today's standards. So what made it happen for him? How did he climb his way to the top of the social ladder? Well, when he was still relatively young, he came into some money after one of his relatives died. $1,000. Now, even back in the 1850s, $1,000 wasn't exactly life-changing money. Getting that would have been like getting about $40,000 today. But it was enough money to give yourself a boost to create the kind of life that you ultimately wanted to live. So naturally, Ward's friends thought that he would take that $1,000 and start a business or make some smart investments. And I guess that in a very loose way, you could say that he made an investment. He bought a fancy suit. Yes, he spent the entire $1,000 on a suit. And while it's easy to dismiss this purchase as just something that a fool would do with his money, and I don't disagree with that, it also gives us a look into his thought process and just how important looking important was to him. How important wanting to be seen in the finest of clothing with the finest of people was to him. How much that mattered to him. To make matters worse, I guess you could say, this suit wasn't designed for going to important business meetings to impress future business partners or clients. This suit was made for a society ball, so that he could impress the wealthy partygoers. It was literally just an extravagant costume that he would wear for only one night. Can you imagine getting a $40,000 inheritance and spending it all on one outfit to wear one time. I know that I can't, but let me know what you would do if you were to get an unexpected $40,000 right now. How would you spend it? I don't know what I'd do with it, but I know that I would not buy an outfit to wear for one night. So here was the situation. There was a socially prominent woman named Mrs. John C. Stevens. She was holding a fancy dress ball, and she gave Ward McAllister an invitation to it. Apparently, this ball had been the talk of the town in the weeks leading up to it. All of the socialites were spending a lot of money for wild costumes to wear to this dance. Ward was thrilled just to get the invitation, and he was not going to pass up on an opportunity to go. But he knew that the costume that he could afford would be no match for what the other attendees would be wearing. But luckily for him, a relative who left him $1,000 died just in time for Ward to be able to get that money and to spend it on a suit. A suit that would help him to not only blend in with the wealthy crowd that he admired so much, but even to stand out among them. Here's how his actions were described in a newspaper from that time. Quote, "No sooner had he pocketed his $1,000 than Ward McAllister hurried off to the most fashionable costumer of that day. He spent the entire amount on his costume, which was the richest and handsomest at the ball, and made Ward McAllister an outstanding figure for a few short hours." End quote. A few short hours. You can tell where his priorities were. After the ball, Ward left to go spend some time in Europe. He liked spending time there because he could live comfortably for less money than he could in New York City. Now, just keep in mind, he had no money, at least not in a significant sense. No high birth, no credentials. So it was nothing more than charm and an expensive suit that opened every door for Ward McAllister. Take note, fellas. But when he returned to NYC, he met the Commodore Vanderbilt, who had by this time become a multi-million-dollar railroad magnate. For some reason, Vanderbilt just liked Ward McAllister. He liked him so much that he wanted to help him out financially. He could see that where finances were concerned, Ward was way out of his league in keeping up with the affluent crowd that he wanted to be around. So Vanderbilt would give McAllister stock market tips, likely some insider trading info, and those tips would allow McAllister to earn some pretty big profits. But what did he do? He spent the money almost as quickly as he earned it, and he didn't use that money to expand his investment portfolio. No, that would have been silly. Ward spent that money on more parties, more expensive dinners, more entertainment that kept his face in the faces of those moneyed people of Manhattan. Commodore Vanderbilt hated seeing Ward be so foolish with his money. He wanted Ward to have a future that would last him a lifetime, so on several occasions, he offered to set up businesses for him. McAllister always refused it, telling Vanderbilt, "Society is my business, and I'll make a success of it." And as we know, he did make a success of it. Unfortunately for him, his successful society business didn't come with any long-term money, at least not the way that Ward ran his business operations. It seems like his company manual could be summed up in one sentence: spend everything you earn on expensive parties. Sounds like a lot of fun, but not sustainable. If it sounds odd to you that a man like Commodore Vanderbilt, who was so focused, so driven, so business-minded, would have kept wasting his time trying to help a foolish man like Ward McAllister become a successful, money-making businessman, here's an anecdote from an 1895 edition of The Sun that might give you some insight. Quote, Commodore Vanderbilt frequently told the story of how McAllister had admitted to him that he had watched a great dinner given by Queen Victoria after having been smuggled through the servants' entrance to Buckingham Palace by an English friend. And to canny Commodore Vanderbilt, that represented an ambition to go places and do things. End quote. I mean, I don't know if a person ever existed who lived more for a gala than Ward McAllister. But back to his society business, he really was a success until he wasn't. But he had a long run, almost 20 years. And it all started and ended with Mrs. Astor, Caroline Skirmerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor, the matriarch of the male line of American Astors. One of her sons was John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man who died on the Titanic. Not long after he hit the social scene in that knockout ball costume, he got to meet Mrs. Astor in 1872. It was reported that that was the supreme moment in his life, and he made the most of it. She liked him too, but she could see that he was in awe of her. She was the top hostess in New York, and it was clear that he knew everything about taking entertaining to new heights. So, to be frank, Mrs. Astor saw in Ward McAllister someone who she could use. And he was so starstruck by her that he was willing to let her do it. With Ward McAllister at her side, all of her society friends who had always accepted her party invitations because she was Caroline Astor were now eager to accept her party invitations because Ward knew how to party. So the replies to her invitations weren't yes, but heck yes. And it was through his connection with Mrs. Astor that the phrase McAllister's 400 was born. When he was helping to stage the production that was the Astor's annual ball, a news reporter went to the location to get some info for the New York World. Mrs. Astor was too busy to talk to the reporter, so she simply put Ward McAllister on the job. And of course, he was all too excited to speak to the press, and especially on behalf of Mrs. Astor. When asked how many people would attend, he told the reporter, quote, "Only 400. Mrs. Astor never has more than 400 guests because that is the capacity of her ballroom." And from there, the 400, or McAllister's 400, was coined and is still associated with his name until this day. And for years, Ward McAllister put on balls, dances, and parties for the well-off set in New York in conjunction with Mrs. Astor. The whole time, he was judging who got to come to his parties and who did not, who got to be a part of society and who could not. Millionaires and their families sought his approval. They needed his nod to know that they were in. And the whole time that this was going on, McAllister was living a very modest life in a small, plain house and barely had any money. But he knew how to put on airs. Some would say, fake it till you make it. Well, Ward knew how to fake it, but he never made it. Yet still, he rose up in the ranks of society as long as he was Mrs. Astor's pet. But you know what they say? What goes up must come down. And after decades of being Mrs. Astor's party man, he went broke. I wonder how all of those millionaires who were not allowed access to high society because Ward McAllister didn't want them there, I wonder how they felt knowing that a poor man who was an imposter was the one who was telling them that they were not good enough. McAllister transitioned from the climactic point to the downhill slope in his society career in 1890. That was when his book, Society as I Have Found It, was published. To be precise, it was called Society as I Have Found It, The Cuisine, culture, and fashions of Europe and North America in the 19th century by a man who toured the era's finds. You know, a quick short title. And the book made him seem as pompous and arrogant as that title sounds. It was meant to be a tell-all about his society parties that detailed some of the most embarrassing and salacious moments of the city's elite. This memoir was supposed to make him a lot of money because he knew that the outsiders wanted to know what was going on behind the doors of those ballrooms. But in the book, he didn't disclose names. It was written in a manner that if you didn't know those situations personally, you would have had a hard time figuring out who he was writing about. He didn't have a kind word to say about anyone in the book, and the critics didn't have a kind word to say about him or his stupid book. As a matter of fact, it made him a subject of ridicule, with a reviewer for The Autocrat writing, quote, "To assume to describe a society destitute of humor, of wit, of position or distinction, of kindly deeds and generous, unostentatious hospitality is but to make the author and the subject alike ridiculous." End quote. This is how he was talking about his friends, the society that he created. And this reviewer is saying if those people are that way, lacking wit, humor, position, etc., you're the one who picked them, so you must be the same way too, Ward. His book didn't end up being the slam that he thought it would be against the people he wrote about. It made everyone look at him like he was stupid. Another critic joked that he would need to write a second book called Society as I Have Lost It. Good joke, and I see what you did there. But that certainly was the case. And was it even worth it for Ward? I wonder. He only made $2,000 from book sales in the end. So it didn't accomplish his goal of making him a rich man. But it did accomplish one thing that he did not expect. His writing that book caused him to fall out of grace with the society that he loved so much and helped to create. But the most crushing part for him was that it made an enemy out of Mrs. Astor, his queen of 20 years. And it is without question that he died a bitter man. The high society that he helped to build turned its back on him when he grew old and out of fashion. He felt as though he had been used and cast aside by a society that had kept him poor instead of making him rich. He really should have listened to Vanderbilt, who had on more than one occasion given him tips on how to get rich. Literally how to get rich. This was probably the only time in the history of man that some get-rich-quick advice actually would have worked. But that's neither here nor there. On the last week of January in 1895, Ward McAllister got sick with the grip. Today we call that influenza or the flu. After being down for a few days, it looked like he would recover. Then he became more ill than the days before. On January 31st, 1895, Ward McAllister died at home, while there was a charity ball going on at Carnegie Hall, an event for which in his better days, he certainly would have been at the top of the guest list. Law really was in this family's DNA. Ward's eldest son and namesake, Ward McAllister Jr., who was not among the family members surrounding him when he died, was also an attorney in California, and that's where he was when his father died. But Ward did have some family at his bedside. His wife was there, his other son, Hayward McAllister, and his daughter, Louise, were all there. And his brother, Reverend Dr. Francis Marion McAllister, was there as well. I told you that I'd get back to him. And this brother also died the same year as Ward. And after all of those years of service devoted to his queen, Mrs. Astor, she did not even attend his funeral. She, instead, held a dinner party that night. Ward McAllister's life is an example of when butt kissing goes tragically wrong. But till this day, he remains the inspiration for the term the 400 or McAllister's 400. You can search his name on Google and the 400 will likely appear. And by the way that he lived a majority of his adult life for the frivolity and pomp and circumstance of high society, he might be honored to know that he is still widely remembered for curating his list of 400 members who are worthy enough for society, in his eyes.
Oscar Wilde was one of the best writers of his time, but not when he wrote this play.
Hello, Mestorians. On The Gilded Age, Season 2, Episode 3, we saw a reimagining of the U.S. debut night of Oscar Wilde's play called Vera. All of the characters on the show hated it, and that seems to fall right in line with how critics reacted to it in August of 1883. I have some of their reviews from various news publications, and I'm going to share some of them with you. But first, I'll give you just a tiny bit of background info on Mr. Wilde, and you let me know if you want the full story because I'd love to give it to you, because this man's total existence was a hot mess. Oscar Wilde was born into what we would consider an upper middle class family. His father was a successful doctor, and his mother stood 6 feet tall and was said to have had a lot of style and charm. Oscar seemed to take after her in that regard. Oscar also had a number of half-siblings because his father cheated on his mother a lot and had children with many of his lovers. Oscar spent the early years of his life dressed as a girl because his mother wanted a daughter so badly that she treated him like he was one. And after Oscar got married, he did as his father had done and cheated on his wife. But unlike his father, who cheated with other women, Oscar cheated on his wife with other men. So, if you're watching The Gilded Age, that should let you know why he understood just what was going on with Oscar Van Ryn and John Adams. Like I said, his story is wild, no pun intended. Let me know if you want a full video on him. But this time, we'll just get into the reviews for Vera, which apparently stunk. P.U. So here's what the Buffalo News had to say on August 22nd, 1883. This is just 2 days after the show debuted. It starts off by saying, New York papers cut up Oscar Wilde's play Vera terribly. Then later, a few lines down, it says, Oscar Wilde says his play is a success, and he has another. Would one not suffice? Oh my, so they said, hey, one is enough, Oscar. You've got more? Please perform them somewhere else. Then the Buffalo News on the same day says, Oscar Wilde's new play, Vera, is not a dramatic success, say the New York critics. It will not make much difference with Oscar, however, for he is well advertised, and people will pay to see his play, even if it is as bad as some written by members of the Metropolitan Press. So at least they're giving him props for getting his ticket sales. People did think that he was an interesting person, so he could sell out a theater. Then the Buffalo Courier Express, the next day on August 23rd, 1883, says, the first play of the season to be given tonight at the Union Square is that by cheeky charlatan Oscar Wilde. It's called Vera, and is notable from the fact that there is only one female character in the piece, which is personated by that highly eccentric female, Marie Prescott. From all I hear, it will be an excellent play to keep away from. The shade. An excellent play to not see. And Marie Prescott is mentioned here. She was the sole actress in the play, and if you recall in the episode of The Gilded Age, that was the one compliment that Oscar Van Ryn could come up with to tell Oscar Wilde after the play, was that he loved her performance. Then the following day, on August 24th, 1883, Democrat and Chronicle says this, after apparently someone died after seeing the play. It says, C.T. Mills, while witnessing the first presentation of Oscar Wilde's new play, Vera, was taken sick and died shortly after his removal from the theater. better evidence of the character of the play is not needed. Oh my goodness, so they are saying this play is so bad that if you see it, you will become sick and die. That's all that you need to know. Don't go see this play. This definitely is a review that would have let me know in 1883 to not bother spending my money. And even though the leading lady was praised by Oscar Van Ryn in the Gilded Age episode, she was not praised when it came to reviews for this play. Here's what the Buffalo Commercial said on August 25th. Miss Marie Prescott's performance was marked by much pugnacity of temperament and a hard, flint-like manner of delivery, angular movements, and metallic vocalism. Miss Prescott was adorned in costly raiment, sometimes of ugly colors, and at moments in the representation she spoke with quite a feline volubility and shrillness. As a disturbance, the acting of this lady is effective, but it lacks tenderness of spirit and grace of style, and is deficient in discretion, balance, polish, and fine intelligence. Well, tell us how you really feel. But Marie Prescott wasn't the only one who got some direct criticism on that day. Also on August 25th in Times-Union, this one wasn't so much about the play as much as it was a direct criticism of Oscar Wilde himself. It says, Mr. Wilde is gradually getting tamed. His long hair and short pants, it says in quotes, have disappeared from the public gaze. His lectures on America and England, though among the few moderately sensible things he has ever said, were a failure. His new play is a complete fiasco. Society no longer makes a lapdog of him, so naturally enough, Oscar is beginning to wonder what in the world is the matter with his little game. Our Niagara and nature's sunsets are not a whit tamer because Oscar thought them incomplete. True art, which is ever truth of nature, is gradually shaking the false art and nonsense out of Oscar. And now, if he will stop talking or writing for a half a dozen years and take up some work, say of scientific advertising, he may yet get to be a civilized and proper man, bangs and all included. So Oscar Wilde was said to have made little slick comments about America. He even did so on the episode of The Gilded Age, and so I guess this is someone having some little slick things to say about him in return. But that wasn't the only review of Oscar Wilde himself on that day. The Democrat and Chronicle also had some things to say about him. Oscar Wilde's play. Oscar Wilde's reappearance here awoke so little notice that the contrast is certainly striking. He is no longer fashionable, and the public now is surprised to think that it could have spent so much money on so worthless an object. He was probably aware of this change before sailing, and hence renounced both his long hair and his breeches came down to an average costume. So now they're talking about how the first time that he visited America, everybody was fascinated with him. He looked like this weird guy because he had this crazy, wild, long hair, and he was wearing short pants. But now, because he realized that the fascination with him has died down, he basically came looking like a regular person. It went on to say, the very name of Oscar Wilde, after such disgusting adulation, may become an object of contempt. His new play is a failure, and though he had a full house, the audience was probably to a large extent composed of deadheads. Well, they were not into Oscar. This person actually said that he was a lapdog on his first trip to America. That's hilarious to me. But again, they gave him credit for selling those tickets. How finally, on August 26, 1883, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle ripped him to shreds so badly that I didn't know where to start or finish, so I'll just show you the whole article and you can pause and read it for yourself if you please. Be prepared, they held back nothing. My voice, as you can see, is still failing me, so I can't read all of this, but you enjoy. And by the way, this show only ran for 1 week. It opened on August 20th, 1883, and this review is from August 26th. The show was literally shut down the day after this review. My sources for this story are This video has been brought to you by me. Well, me and my new YouTube channel, Verified YouTube Guide. Are you just starting your YouTube journey and feeling overwhelmed? Don't worry, I've got you covered. My channel, Verified YouTube Guide, is your go-to resource for practical, step-by-step tips to grow and monetize your channel. It's literally follow-along video tutorials. I'm showing you the steps I took to get 180,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you don't know how to do something, you can just copy my work one step at a time. From setting up your channel to showing you how you can earn money at any stage on YouTube. And I'm not just talking about YouTube ad revenue. If you have something important to say or a service to sell, start talking about it on YouTube now. Don't wait. Subscribe to Verified YouTube Guide today, and let's build your channel together. You don't have to figure this out alone. The link is in the description box. I'll see you there. I hope that you have enjoyed this tale so far. If you love these scandalous stories from history that make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Give this video a thumbs up. It's free and helps a ton. Whether you're watching or listening, thank you for letting me be a part of your day. HBO's The Gilded Age. Hey, I'm gonna put you outside.